Brady Coleman was 28, had an MBA, and was about to cost this company $15 million in federal contracts. But he thought I was the problem. "Stay away from Mitchell," he'd whisper to every new hire who walked into our department at Hartwell Industries. "He's old school and set in his ways. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet warnings delivered with this concerned look, like he was protecting them from some dinosaur who couldn't adapt to modern business practices." And they believed him. Every single one bought it without question. For 8 months, I watched this kid repeat the same routine. 8 months of people looking at me, then looking away. 8 months of being the guy nobody wanted on their project team. The words weren't sharp like a slap. They were slow like poison, seeping into every meeting I'd never be invited to join, every decision I'd never get to influence. The worst part? I had to let it happen. Because what these people didn't know could either save this company or destroy it. And I was the only one positioned to figure out which. My name is Mitchell Barnes, and I'm 49 years old. Most people at Hartwell figured I was just another financial analyst who'd been around too long, probably counting days until retirement. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the last 22 years becoming something most companies pray they'll never need: a forensic accounting specialist. The kind of guy who can smell financial fraud from 3 departments away. The kind who's put executives in federal prison for cooking books. I wasn't at Hartwell by accident. 9 months earlier, Lawrence Davis, the CEO, had called me personally. His voice was tight when he explained their situation. They'd landed a massive defense contract, $15 million over 2 years, to manufacture precision components for military vehicles. Great news, except federal contracts come with serious oversight. One accounting screw-up, one compliance violation, and they wouldn't just lose the money. They'd face criminal investigation. Lawrence needed someone to evaluate their financial controls from the inside, not as a consultant. Those guys get the sanitized tour. He needed someone who could see what really happened when nobody was performing for outsiders. Someone who could blend in as a regular employee. That's where my background came in handy. Before specializing in forensic work, I'd done my time in corporate finance. I could handle day-to-day analyst work without breaking a sweat. More importantly, after 4 years in the Marines, I knew how to follow orders and keep my mouth shut when the mission required it. The plan was straightforward. Take a standard analyst position, reporting to their financial manager. Only Lawrence would know my real purpose. Spend 6 to 8 months observing their processes, document any compliance issues, then provide a confidential report with recommendations. Clean and professional. What we didn't count on was Brady Coleman. Brady had been promoted to financial manager just 3 months before I arrived. On paper, he looked decent enough. MBA from a decent state school, 3 years at a mid-sized accounting firm. But within my first week, I could see the real story. This kid had gotten the job because he was good at office politics, not because he understood financial controls. He talked a good game in meetings, threw around the right buzzwords, and had this way of making his inexperience sound like innovative thinking. The problem was, he seemed to sense I knew more than I was letting on. Maybe it was how I'd catch errors he missed, or the way I'd ask questions that cut straight through his carefully crafted explanations. Whatever tipped him off, Brady figured out pretty quickly that having me around made him look bad. So he started what I came to think of as the whisper campaign. It began during my second week. I was in the break room getting coffee when I heard 2 junior analysts talking by the vending machines. Brady mentioned that Mitchell's one of those old-timer types who doesn't adapt well to team-based approaches, one was saying. He told us not to take it personally if Mitchell seems resistant to collaborative projects. I stood there stirring sugar into my coffee, understanding exactly what was happening. Brady couldn't fire me. I was performing well, and Lawrence had made it clear I was staying. But he could neutralize me by poisoning the well. If everyone believed I was difficult to work with, they'd avoid me. And if they avoided me, I'd have less influence, less access to sensitive information, and less credibility if I ever tried to raise concerns about what I was seeing. It was actually pretty smart, and it was working perfectly. By month 3, the isolation was complete. Team meetings became exercises in being professionally ignored. Brady would assign high-visibility projects to analysts with half my experience right in front of me, explaining why each person was perfect for this type of collaborative work. Complex financial analysis went to people who'd been there 6 months. Strategic planning assignments went to analysts who openly admitted they were learning as they went. Meanwhile, I got stuck with all the grunt work nobody else wanted. reconciling accounts that hadn't been touched in months, processing expense reports that should have been handled weeks earlier, reviewing procurement documentation that other people had messed up and needed someone to fix. What Brady didn't realize was that he was giving me exactly what I needed. All that unglamorous work, it was showing me every crack in Hartwell's financial foundation. Those expense reports revealed patterns of poor spending controls. The procurement documents showed suppliers getting paid without proper approval processes. And those neglected account reconciliations? They uncovered discrepancies that should have triggered investigations months ago. I kept notes on everything. Not dramatically, not obviously, just documenting what I observed. By month 5, I had a clear picture of how Hartwell's financial controls were failing. Nothing criminal, nothing intentionally fraudulent, but plenty of sloppy practices that could trigger serious regulatory violations if discovered during a federal audit. The real problem was Brady himself. He was making decisions about financial controls without understanding what those controls were supposed to prevent. He'd streamlined processes to make them faster, not realizing he was eliminating crucial safeguards. He'd handed oversight responsibilities to junior people who didn't know what red flags looked like. He was creating exactly the kind of compliance vulnerabilities that could destroy a company. And I couldn't say a word about it. If I raised concerns, I'd sound like exactly what Brady had told everyone I was. Some difficult old-timer who couldn't adapt to modern methods. Worse, it might blow my cover before I'd gathered enough evidence to make comprehensive recommendations to Lawrence. So I kept quiet and kept taking notes. But it was eating at me. I'd spent 4 years in the Marines, learning that you protect the people who depend on you. Hartwell employed 350 people, most of them manufacturing workers with families to support. If this company lost its federal contract because of sloppy financial controls, those people would lose their jobs. If regulatory violations led to criminal charges, some of them might lose their pensions too. I could hear the factory floor from my desk, the steady hum of CNC machines cutting precision parts, the pneumatic hiss of assembly equipment, the occasional call-out from supervisors coordinating shift changes. These weren't abstract numbers on spreadsheets. These were real people doing real work, depending on management to keep the business running clean. That's when Andrew Sullivan showed up in month 7. Andrew was 24, fresh out of college with a finance degree, hired as a junior analyst. Like all the new hires, he got the full Brady Coleman orientation on his first day. I was working late trying to reconcile a manufacturing overhead account that should have been squared away weeks ago when I heard Brady giving Andrew the standard warning. "Mitchell's been here a while," Brady was saying in that concerned tone he'd perfected. "He's got experience, but he's pretty set in his ways. Doesn't work well with team-oriented approaches. I'm not saying he's a bad guy, just giving you a heads up so you don't take it personally if he seems resistant to collaboration." Andrew nodded and said all the right things. But over the next few days, I noticed something different about this kid. Unlike the other new hires, Andrew actually watched what people did instead of just listening to what they said. He asked questions when things didn't make sense, and he seemed to notice that my actual behavior didn't match Brady's description. On his 3rd day, Andrew approached my desk with a problem. "I'm working on this. Variance analysis for the manufacturing costs," he said. "And I keep getting numbers that don't balance with the monthly reports. Could you take a look?" I glanced at his screen. He was trying to reconcile overhead allocations, but he was using the wrong depreciation schedule. Honest mistake, the kind that happens when you don't know that we had 3 different schedules for different equipment categories. "You're pulling the building depreciation for the machinery costs," I told him. "Try the equipment schedule from the fixed asset register instead." His face lit up. "That's exactly it. How did you spot that so fast?" "Experience," I said. "Brady told me you were old school," Andrew said. "He didn't mention you were also right." Over the next 2 weeks, Andrew started bringing me technical questions. Nothing major, just details that weren't covered in the standard orientation. How to handle intercompany transfers between our Cincinnati plant and the satellite facility in Kentucky. Which approval levels applied to different types of capital expenses. Where to find historical cost data that wasn't in the current system. I helped him because that's what you do when someone wants to learn. But I was careful not to go beyond basic technical guidance. I couldn't afford to look like I was undermining Brady's authority. Then Andrew started noticing things on his own. "Mitchell," he said one afternoon, pulling his chair over to my desk, I've been reviewing these supplier payments for the machining center maintenance, and some of them don't have proper purchase order documentation. Isn't that a compliance issue?" My stomach tightened. It was definitely a compliance issue, the kind that could trigger federal violations if discovered during an audit, the kind that Brady should have been catching and fixing instead of delegating to junior analysts who didn't understand the regulatory implications. "You should discuss that with Brady," I said carefully. I did. He said those are legacy issues from before we implemented the new procurement system. Told me not to worry about them. That made it worse. These weren't legacy issues. I'd checked the dates. These were recent payments, processed under Brady's direct management. He was either ignoring serious compliance problems, or he genuinely didn't understand how dangerous they were. "Did he say anything else?" I asked. Andrew hesitated. "He said you might try to turn small documentation issues into big compliance concerns because that's how old-school finance people think. He told me to focus on improving future processes instead of dwelling on past paperwork." There it was. Brady wasn't just isolating me. He was preemptively discrediting any concerns I might raise. If I said anything about compliance violations, it would be dismissed as old-school thinking. If I tried to explain the regulatory implications, it would be written off as dwelling on paperwork. That night, I called Lawrence from my home office. I explained what I was seeing, the control weaknesses, the documentation problems, the pattern of Brady dismissing serious compliance concerns. Lawrence listened without interrupting. "How bad is it?" he asked finally. "Bad enough that a federal audit would find violations," I said. "Not criminal bad, but penalty bad, and definitely contract-threatening bad." Long pause. "What do you recommend?" "I need more time to document everything properly. But Lawrence, you should know that if this continues much longer, you're going to have bigger problems than just my report. Meaning someone else is going to notice these issues, and when they do, they're going to ask why management didn't catch them first." Lawrence agreed to give me another month, but as it turned out, I didn't need that long. The breakthrough came 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon when the factory was running overtime to meet a delivery deadline. Andrew was working on a complex analysis of manufacturing overhead costs when he hit a wall. The numbers weren't balancing, and he couldn't figure out why. "Mitchell, could you help me understand something?" he asked, wheeling his chair over with his laptop. "I'm trying to reconcile the overhead allocation for our defense work, but there's a $47,000 difference between what's allocated to the federal contract and what's recorded in our general ledger." I looked at his spreadsheet. He'd done everything correctly. The problem was that someone had been recording overhead costs to the wrong accounts. Not huge amounts, but consistent enough to materially misstate the cost being charged to the government contract. This wasn't just a compliance issue anymore. This was potential fraud. If Hartwell was mischarging costs to a federal contract, even accidentally, it could trigger criminal investigation, the kind that destroys companies and sends executives to prison. "Andrew," I said quietly, "who's been approving these overhead allocations?" He clicked through the system approval history. "Brady signed off on all of them over the past 6 months." I stared at the screen, my mind racing through the implications. "Print out all the documentation for these allocations. Everything. And don't mention this to anyone else until I figure out what's going on." "Should I tell Brady?" "Not yet. Give me 24 hours. That night, I took all the documentation home and spread it across my kitchen table. What I found made my blood run cold. The pattern was crystal clear. Costs that should have been charged to commercial work were systematically being shifted to the defense contract. Nothing massive, nothing obvious to casual review, but consistent enough to significantly inflate the profitability of commercial jobs while overcharging the government. I was looking at either systematic incompetence or deliberate fraud. Either way, it had to stop immediately. But I knew that if I took this to Brady directly, he'd find some way to dismiss it or blame it on someone else. He'd probably say I was making mountains out of molehills or not understanding the new allocation methodology. I needed to go straight to Lawrence. The next morning, I called Lawrence and asked for an emergency meeting. "We have a problem with the defense contract," I said, "a big one." We met in his office at 7 a.m. before most people arrived. I laid out the overhead allocation issues, showed him the documentation, explained the potential criminal implications. Lawrence's face went pale as he understood what he was looking at. "How long has this been going on?" At least 6 months based on what Andrew found, maybe longer. But Lawrence, there's something else you need to know. Andrew Sullivan discovered this issue. He's sharp, he's thorough, and he's asking the right questions. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Andrew might want to know more about who he's really working with, and I'm thinking maybe it's time for some people around here to learn who they've really been working with all along. Lawrence nodded slowly. Set up a meeting. You, me, Andrew, and Catherine Reynolds from HR, this afternoon. The meeting was scheduled for 4 p.m. in the main conference room. I spent the day organizing my findings, preparing documentation, trying to figure out how to explain 8 months of investigation without sounding like I'd been spying on my colleagues. Andrew arrived looking nervous. He knew something big was happening, but he didn't know what. Catherine looked curious but wary. HR directors develop strong instincts about when meetings might lead to terminations. Andrew, Lawrence said once we were seated around the polished conference table, Mitchell has something he needs to explain to you, about his role here and about what you've been discovering. I took a breath. Andrew, for the past 8 months, I've been conducting a compliance assessment for this company, not as a regular analyst, as a forensic accounting specialist. That overhead allocation issue you found? It's part of a much larger pattern of control weaknesses that could cost this company its federal contracts. Andrew stared at me. You're not just a financial analyst. I'm a forensic accountant. I've written 2 textbooks on financial fraud investigation. I've consulted for the SEC, the FBI, and about 50 companies that discovered they had serious compliance problems. But you've been working here as a regular analyst for 8 months, because that was the only way to see what really happens when nobody's performing for outsiders. If I'd come in as a consultant, everyone would have been on their best behavior. I needed to see the actual processes, the real controls, the day-to-day decisions that create problems. Andrew was quiet for a long moment. That's why Brady kept telling people you were difficult. He was trying to isolate you. Brady sensed I knew more than I was letting on. He couldn't fire me, so he neutralized me by making sure nobody would listen to me or work with me. But why didn't you just tell everyone who you really were? Because then people would have changed their behavior. I wouldn't have learned about the real problems. And Andrew, there are real problems. That overhead allocation issue you found, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I spent the next hour walking through my complete findings, the control weaknesses, the documentation gaps, the compliance violations that could trigger federal investigation. Not to blame anyone, not to embarrass anyone, but to show how systematic these problems had become under Brady's management. The procurement violations, suppliers getting paid without proper purchase orders, the expense report approvals bypassing required reviews, the intercompany transfers between our Cincinnati plant and Kentucky facility being recorded incorrectly. Each issue by itself was manageable. Together, they painted a picture of financial controls that had completely broken down. The defense contract makes all of this 10 times more serious, I explained. Commercial accounting mistakes are civil matters. Federal contract accounting mistakes can become criminal matters very quickly. When I finished, Andrew asked the question I'd been hoping for. What happens now? Now, Lawrence said, we fix this. All of it. Before it destroys this company. Catherine leaned forward. What about Brady? Lawrence looked at me. What do you recommend? I'd been thinking about this for weeks. Brady created these problems because he doesn't understand financial controls well enough to manage them properly. The question is whether he can learn fast enough or whether he's fundamentally unsuited for this type of work. And your assessment, my assessment, is that he's more interested in looking good than in being good. That's not something you can train out of someone. Plus, he's spent 8 months actively undermining the one person who could have helped him avoid these problems. Lawrence nodded grimly. I'll handle Brady. The conversation with Brady happened the next morning. I wasn't there, but word spread through the office quickly. Brady was terminated immediately, effective immediately. Not for malice, not for intentional fraud, but for creating compliance risks that threatened the company's most important contract. The announcement sent shockwaves through the finance department. People who'd avoided me for 8 months suddenly wanted to understand what had really been going on. The whisper campaign died overnight, replaced by a completely different kind of attention. But the real work was just beginning. Lawrence authorized a comprehensive compliance overhaul, with me leading the effort. We had to fix 8 months of accumulated problems before they triggered a federal audit that could destroy the company. The first priority was damage control. We immediately corrected the overhead allocation errors, filed amended reports with the contracting office, and implemented emergency controls to prevent further mischarging. The legal team prepared disclosure documentation in case federal investigators came calling. It was controlled panic, professional, systematic, but unmistakably urgent. Next came the training program, 6 sessions over 3 weeks, mandatory attendance for all finance and management staff. I didn't just present problems, I presented real solutions. Practical ways to prevent the issues I'd been documenting for months. Session 1 covered basic federal contracting requirements. These weren't abstract regulations, they were rules that, if violated, could put real people in federal prison. The room was packed. People who'd avoided me for 8 months suddenly wanted to understand what they'd been missing. Here's what most people don't realize about defense contracts, I told them. The government doesn't just audit your numbers, they audit your processes. They want to see that you have systems in place to prevent problems, not just fix them after they happen. I walked them through actual case studies. Companies that lost everything because they thought compliance was just paperwork. Executives who went to prison because they trusted subordinates who didn't understand the stakes. Session 2 focused on financial controls. Controls aren't red tape, I explained. They're insurance policies. Every shortcut you take, every approval you skip, every documentation requirement you ignore, that's not efficiency. That's risk accumulation. Andrew attended every session, asking sharp questions, taking detailed notes. He understood something that Brady never had, that financial controls exist to protect the company, not to slow it down. By session 3, word had spread beyond the finance department. Manufacturing supervisors started showing up, wanting to understand how their production decisions affected contract compliance. Plant managers attended to learn about cost allocation requirements. Even some of the machinists came, curious about why their overtime hours had to be documented so precisely. This affects all of us, I told them during session 4. Every hour you work on federal contract components has to be tracked accurately. Every material that goes into those parts has to be costed correctly. It's not about micromanaging, it's about protecting 350 jobs. That got their attention. These weren't abstract compliance requirements anymore. This was about keeping their families fed, their mortgages paid, their kids in college. Session 5 covered procurement controls, the issues Andrew had first discovered. When you approve a purchase order, I explained, you're not just authorizing spending, you're creating a legal obligation. And with federal contracts, those obligations have to be documented properly or they become violations. Session 6 was different. Instead of presenting more problems, I focused on solutions. Real, practical ways to build compliance into daily operations without slowing down production. The goal isn't perfect paperwork, I told them. The goal is sustainable. Processes that protect this company and everyone who works here. The response was better than I'd hoped. People started bringing me questions, real questions about specific situations they were facing. They wanted to understand not just what to do, but why it mattered. 3 months later, we passed our first federal compliance audit without a single finding. The auditors were actually impressed with our controls. They'd rarely seen such comprehensive documentation and systematic processes at a company our size. 6 months later, we won the follow-on contract, $22 million over 3 years. The manufacturing workers kept their jobs, their families stayed secure, and their retirement accounts stayed intact. Lawrence offered me the position of Chief Financial Risk Officer, with full authority over compliance and controls. I accepted, but only after negotiating the right to bring in additional forensic specialists when needed. Because what I'd learned at Hartwell was that most companies don't fail because of evil people doing evil things. They fail because good people don't know how to recognize problems before those problems become disasters. Andrew was promoted to senior analyst and given responsibility for ongoing compliance monitoring. He'd demonstrated something rare in corporate America, the ability to ask difficult questions and the courage to pursue answers, even when those answers might be uncomfortable. My experience became a case study in my 3rd textbook published last year. I used real scenarios from Hartwell, but no names, no identifying details. Just the lessons about how companies can choose learning over defensiveness when they're willing to face uncomfortable truths. The book's gotten good reviews, especially from practitioners who understand the difference between theoretical compliance and real-world implementation. Several universities are using it in their forensic accounting programs. Brady found work at another company about 6 months after his termination. I don't know if he learned anything from what happened at Hartwell. I genuinely hope he did. The business world is full of young managers who get promoted too fast, given too much responsibility without enough understanding of the consequences. But I also hope his new employers understand the difference between someone who talks about financial management and someone who actually knows how to do it. Looking back, those 8 months of isolation were some of the most valuable of my career. When you're not part of the social dynamics, you see them more clearly. When people forget you're there, they show you who they really are. And when you're trusted with people's livelihoods, you learn that expertise without courage is just decoration. The factory still hums the same way. CNC machines cutting precise tolerances, assembly lines building components that keep military vehicles running in dangerous places. But now the paperwork matches the work, the controls protect the workers, and the compliance systems actually prevent problems instead of just documenting them after they happen. If you've ever been the person everyone was warned about, if you've ever watched incompetence disguise itself as innovation, or if you've ever wondered what really happens when experience meets politics in corporate America, remember this: the most important voices are often the ones people try hardest to silence. And sometimes, if you're patient enough and principled enough, those voices get the last word.